just want to say thank you to Kansas Family Support Center for this opportunity. So as Jacob indicated, my name is Sophia Bond. The title of my presentation today is going to be Understanding the Role of the Department of Education, the effects of its possible or potential dismantling, and any potential ramifications for families and students with disabilities. And I'm a person that normally talks really fast. So I am intentionally trying to talk slower today. And if it feels like I'm speaking quickly, please just drop it in the chat and I'll try my best to kind of slow down a bit. And as Jacob indicated, you're more than welcome to ask any questions that you have. You can feel free to drop those in the chat and I will answer them at the end of my presentation. And so I have a picture on the left of me when I'm looking a lot better. I'm 9 months pregnant right now, so I am in the trenches finishing up my last couple weeks. In regards to my background, I think the word that Jacob meant to say was guardian ad litem. I won't rehash my career and some of the activities that I'm involved in, but I am a volunteer guardian ad litem as well for the Jackson County CASA. And so I represent children in the 16th Circuit who have been abused and neglected. Typically, I represent infants. And so that's one of the responsibilities that I do in addition to my day work. And then the picture of me on the right just kind of shows me doing my hobbies. I really enjoy traveling and I'm a self-proclaimed foodie, although my husband would probably say otherwise. But that's a picture of me eating a hot dog in Central Park, New York. And I can't wait to go back there. It's one of my favorite places. All right, so I have to give a little bit of a disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed are solely my own and do not represent those of the federal and state government. Because I am a federal employee, it's one of the things that I have to say, so I am saying it. Okay, so what we're going to cover today, we're essentially going to break this down into 3 focus areas. The first is understanding the role of the U.S. Department of Education and its impacts on families and students. The second topic that we will discuss is the possible effects of its potential dismantling on families and students. And then lastly, understanding the impacts of state and federal education laws on students with disabilities and or other behavioral support needs and how to better support those groups and students. Okay, so first we'll talk about the purpose of the U.S. Department of Education. I would recommend, if you are unfamiliar with their website, to definitely give it a look-see. It's a very comprehensive and thorough website that has a lot of good information for school districts, parents, students, and just others who are interested in their laws and policies in general. And that information can be found at www.ed.gov. I think the website is very user-friendly. And there's also a lot of policy, procedures, as well as opinions that the U.S. Department of Education issues that are identified on the website. And so one particular purpose is that the U.S. Department of Education plays a critical role in shaping the education system in our country. The original Department of Education was created in 1867 to collect information on schools and teachings that would help states establish effective school systems. However, the Department of Education was established by Congress in 1980 with the Department of Education Organization Act. And so the mission of the Department of Education is to promote student achievement and preparation for global competitiveness by fostering educational excellence and ensuring equal access for students of all ages. Now, typically when you think of education, it is primarily a state and local responsibility. And thus, with that, the local and state governments are the ones who develop curricula and determine requirements for things such as like enrollment and graduation, not really the federal government. However, most of the school funding actually comes from their particular school, or excuse me, their particular state or local government. A lot of people think that the bulk of their funding comes from the federal government, and that's just not true. The U.S. Department of Education does oversee some federal education policies and manages some school funding, and also works to ensure that there's equitable access to the quality of the education that the different school districts are providing. All right. So besides receiving funds from the Department of Education, school districts may often receive federal financial assistance from which other federal agencies? And you can drop that in the chat if you have any ideas or guesses. Okay, I'm seeing at least one correct answer. I'll give it like 10 more seconds. All right. All right, looks like you all had some right answers there. So the first would be the Department of Health and Human Services. That's where you see your Head Start programs. So if you have a school district or school that has a Head Start program, more than likely they do receive federal financial assistance from the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, how that formula is calculated is based on a bunch of different factors, but typically they will receive those funds. And then also the Department of Agriculture, if your school or school district receives assistance with their school lunch program. And so if there's a school district that has like a free lunch program or reduced lunch program, typically those funds are being subsidized by the Department of Agriculture. All right. So we're going to next talk about the role of the Department of Education. And so we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into areas in regards to ensuring access to education, establishing national standards, equity and inclusion, and then policy influence. So when ensuring access to education, the Department of Education enforces laws and policies related to children in preschool, elementary school, middle school, and high school. They also establish and enforce laws and policies related to higher education and higher education institutions. Some professional institutions such as law school, and then there's others that they may not. So it's really subjective depending on the particular specialties. They also ensure laws enacted to counter discrimination of all types of educational environments, particularly those such as IDEA, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, which was created to protect the rights of students with disabilities. And we'll talk about IDEA a little bit later in the presentation. And then regarding access for parents, the Department of Education enforces the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, or better known as FERPA, which provides certain rights for parents regarding their children's education records. And so I've seen several cases from like a guardian ad litem perspective where there has been issues regarding custody and who should have access to like certain documents and that sort of thing. And so school districts normally are aware of those kind of issues, and there may be special requirements for like requesting records and transferring records. Just something to be aware of if you end up in a situation where records are of relevancy. And then regarding ensuring access and funding to education, the Department of Education enforces the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. ESEA is the acronym for that. That was enacted in 1965 to ensure equal access and opportunity for all students. And then it was reauthorized several times. I believe the latest time was in 2015 under President Obama. And that's the Every Student Succeed Act, better known as ESSA. Under ESSA, there are 9 titles. I won't go through all of them, but a couple that may be of relevancy that I feel like come up time and time again are preparing and training and recruitment of teachers, principals, and other school leaders. Those ESL programs, English learner and immigrant for English learner and immigrant students. Programs related to Indian, Native Hawaiian, and Alaskan Native educations. And then certain programs related to Title IX, which involve sex, gender, and that sort of thing. All right. Next, we're going to talk about that second function, which is establishing national standards. And so the Department of Education does develop some national curricular standards and assessments. And this is important because it helps to ensure that students are receiving a certain level of information or curricula that is being somewhat assessed on a routine basis. And then secondly, the department supports educational research and data collection. And we all know research and data collection is super important. And in order to determine if those standards and assessments are effective, there has to be some form of data collection that connects the information to the desired goals and outcomes. And the best way to do that has been to have a process for how that information should be assessed and collected. And then lastly, the department administers federal financial aid for students. And although there has been some recent talks of this function or responsibility potentially being housed in a different federal agency, right now it does still remain the responsibility of the U.S. Department of Education. I'll also note that typically federal funds are administered obviously differently for K through 12 as they are for post-secondary education. If you've been to college, we all have had our own experiences with student loans and know that financial process is different if you're participating in free public education as opposed to like post-secondary education or private education. All right. For the third area, we have equity and inclusion. And so regarding education equity, under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, this act prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin in programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. So this also would apply to any school or school district. If they receive federal financial assistance from the U.S. Department of Education, they would be subject to being compliant with those Title VI standards. Also under Title IX, there is a prohibition of discrimination based on sex that includes discrimination based on sex stereotypes, pregnancy or related conditions, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Gender identity is a big topic that has been discussed in the press right now. However, it's still included in the regulations and statutes. And then kind of that last area that probably affects most of us would be under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and then Title II of the American with Disability Act, better known as Section 504 and Title II, are sections that prohibit discrimination based on disabilities. So I always say, if you ever find yourself being curious about obligations that the school or school district has in regards to your children who may have disabilities, it's always a good idea to check out those regulations and check out those statutes and laws associated. Okay, and then lastly, for policy, the federal government sets national policy on issues such as student loans, teacher certification, school safety, and education technology, and then issues guidance related to those topics. And again, a lot of that information can be found on their website. So I would definitely recommend checking that out if you have a free moment or two. All right. We're now going to discuss some of those possible effects of dismantling the U.S. Department of Education on families and students. And first, I'm going to talk about it from more, I guess, like of a big media or large media lens, and then I'll talk about it from a parental and student lens. And so, as you know, there has been well, I'm sure many may know, there has been a proposal for dismantling or significantly reducing the Department of Education's roles. And there are arguments that include decentralizing and returning decision makings to the state or local government. We won't get into the politics of the matter, but I will highlight just a few possible effects for families and students from, again, from a big media perspective, and then from the perspective of parents and families. So when you look at those, some of the pros from a big media perspective, advocacy for more local control over schools to better meet the unique needs of that particular environment is one particular area that has been discussed. Now, we know that some communities are different and may have needs that others do not have. And so those individuals living and working in the community are likely to be the best resources to identify what are the particular needs for their students and families, and empowering them to be able to do so has been seen as a pro by big media. Also, as a byproduct of putting the power in the hands of the state or local government, this will reduce federal spending and oversight, which could offset the national deficit and other financial interests. Again, speculative, but this is some of the arguments that big media has presented to the masses. As far as cons, the risk of reducing equity in education, especially for disadvantaged students. If there is no big government oversight, who would hold smaller government responsible for equity, right? Making sure that everyone has the same opportunities. I think historically, we have seen that disadvantaged students or vulnerable groups are often most impacted when there is not that larger oversight. And so that would be an obstacle that smaller governments or school districts would have to essentially just be prepared for, would have to come up with a plan. In regards to loss of uniformity educational standards, again, who would be ensuring that the overarching education standards are being met by the school districts and holding the districts with underperforming students accountable? There would just need to be a plan for that. And then lastly, for school districts that are underfunded or that struggle with resources, who would ensure that those students still receive the appropriate resources to be competitive on levels with their counterparts, either locally and or nationally? Let me just do a time check. Okay, I'm doing all right. um, Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at this information from the lens of a parent or student, particularly a parent that has a student in one of these vulnerable populations or groups, such as students with disabilities. There could be increased disparities. So, a lack of federal oversight could lead to greater inequality in education opportunities, particularly for low income areas, right? Because we know a lot of that funding comes from taxpayers. And so, if you have lower income areas, there may not be as much tax revenue collected for the school districts. Loss of special programs, federal programs for students with disabilities, Title I funding, which goes to low income school fundings, and other targeted initiatives could face cuts. Then it could be decreased access to federal funding. The federal government provides essential funding aid for higher education, and dismantling the Department of Education could limit or remove access to like Pell Grants, federal loans, or other work study programs. And so if you're an individual that decides to go to a post-secondary educational institution and need those financial supplements, again, you would need to essentially have a plan on how you could receive that assistance. And then increased burden on families. Without federal financial support, families could face higher costs for education, particularly in low income communities, which could translate into some sort of out of pocket cost for families. There could also be changes to curriculum and standards, so like a lack of a national standard process. The Department of Education does work in setting some of those uniform standards for education. And without this, the states and local school districts could develop very different standards, leading to a more fragmented educational experience, which could be quite a challenge. Federal standardized tests, like those administered by the Department of Education, could be eliminated or altered, impacting assessments that ensure students meet a certain academic standard. Ironically, the SAT, ACT is not one of those, but there are other standards that could be, particularly impacted. And when you're looking at state and federal control variations across the state, without federal oversight, some states may struggle to implement successful education programs, while others may thrive. And so this would create a patchwork system where educational opportunities are dependent on state budgets and political priorities. And then states with fewer resources may not be able to invest as much of their educational system, therefore exacerbating inequality between like rich and poor states. And then lastly, which is kind of like really tugs in my heart because I'm a big advocate of teachers and professional staff. Teachers often rely on resources and training provided by the Department of Education. And so a reduction in this support could hinder their professional development, leading to a lower quality of teaching. I know in several of the school districts in the local metropolitan area that I live in, they have been a little bit more laxed on some of those standards because they've had difficulties finding teachers, finding people that want to remain in the school district, whether it's based on pay, behaviors, etc. And without federal regulations and support, teachers' salaries, benefits, and job security could become inconsistent across the different school districts. All right. And so now I want to get into that last topic area and discuss the impact of state and federal education laws on students with disabilities and or other behavioral support needs, and then how to best support those students. So the individual education program, or I'm sorry, let me go back a little bit. So under IDEA, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, it provides that students with disabilities receive a free appropriate public education, or FAPE, in the least restrictive environment, LRE. And so one of the requirements, if you do have a student who has been identified as a student with a disability, they should be evaluated for an individualized education program, which is better known as an IEP by its acronym, that's tailored to each particular student. And so with an IEP, some of the structure and requirements for that process can be found under 34 CFR 300-24. That's where that information is housed. But if you're unfamiliar with an IEP, it's essentially an education and supportive services plan that is uniquely tailored to meet the special needs of a student with a disability. And within that document, it identifies the specific education and related services that are needed in order for a student to be successful in a particular education setting. When you're thinking about developing the IEP, typically there's a team involved, and that team is going to be assessing several factors. Some of those factors may include the strength of the child, concerns of the parent for enhancing the education of their child, the results of like an initial or most recent evaluation that the child has had, and then the academic development and functional needs of the child. Now, there are some special factors that can be considered, such as whether or not the child has limited English proficiency, if a child is blind or visually impaired and may need specific instruction in Braille or other supportive services, and then whether or not there's like barriers to communication that the child's have. And in those cases, it may be for children who are deaf or hard of hearing, and consider whether or not there's special language or communication mechanisms that are needed. And so the school would also be considering whether those particular students need like assistive technology devices and related services. IEPs should be developed collaboratively, meaning that people who are most familiar with the student and who will provide those supportive services are the ones involved in the meeting. Typically, those are going to be the teachers or other educators, other school professionals or personnel, other professionals or personnel, the parents, and then sometimes the students, depending on the age. Other types of services that are involved under IDEA for students to make sure they receive a FAPE, free appropriate public education, are behavioral supports through functional behavioral assessments, FBAs, and then behavioral intervention plans, or BIPs. And so a BFA normally includes like the gathering of information to better understand the student behaviors, as opposed to the BIP, which is a plan that's developed from the BFA that outlines strategies and supports needed to address certain behaviors, which is kind of similar to an IEP. And then lastly, there may be certain protections afforded for these students for disciplinary actions, such as something called a manifestation determination hearing. In the event a student who has an IEP does have some sort of disciplinary action, trying to think of something off my head, maybe gets into a school fight or something of that nature, they would be subjected to something called a manifestation determination hearing. And this is essentially a process where the school district is going to evaluate the student's misconduct to determine whether or not it is connected to their disability or IEP rather than some other purpose. And so this hearing protects the student who has disabilities. Sorry, let me go back. This hearing will protect the student who has disabilities from discrimination in the event their misconduct is actually the result of that particular disability. And so it's very important that school districts hold these hearings. All right, and then we have the Section 504, which is, again, part of the Rehabilitation Act. And it also has certain guidelines and parameters for eligible students with a disability to make sure that they receive a FAPE, again, free appropriate education. And so with the 504, it needs to accompany something called a 504 plan. And with the 504 plan, it outlines accommodations and modifications needed to ensure equal access to education. And that information can be found at 34 CFR 104. Now, when you're looking at the difference between IDEA, the IEP, and then Section 504, IDEA focuses more on providing that special education services to the student with disabilities versus Section 504 prohibits discrimination against students with disabilities. And so that Section 504 is going to be a little bit more broader, and it's going to focus on ensuring equal access to education. Then under IDEA, the student must have a specific disability that falls within a category outlined by law and a demonstrated need for specialized instruction. While under Section 504, it applies to individuals with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of their major life activities. And so within that statute, you can look and see some of the examples of major life activities or functions that could be potentially subject to this area. That's caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, and working. Can you have both plans? Technically, yes, but normally it's not necessary because everything that is included in a Section 504 could also be included in your IEP, but not the other way around. So, that's something that if your student is in need of that Section 504, that plan could be included in their IEP if they do have an IEP. Okay, and then under the ADA, or Americans with a Disability Act, that's an act that also provides civil rights protections for students in school and in the community. Often it will ensure physical and programmatic accessibility, which sometimes we may see that if there may be a situation where a student has obstacles related to, let's say, physically getting into a school building because they have a wheelchair, or not being able to use a certain restroom, and so they may need a larger stall or lower sinks, that sort of thing. And under this particular act, it will require schools to provide those reasonable accommodations for students with behavioral needs. Now, there are all kind of other secondary laws that may limit what the school district has to do, such as if it's a historic building, there may be exceptions to where they may not require that particular building to have or install an elevator based on the declaration of the building. However, if it's feasible for the district and can be accommodated, then the expectation would be that the school district would make those reasonable accommodations. Now, what is reasonable is going to be subjective, but making sure that the student has access to the school and a way to be effective is going to be most important. Okay. Some additional supports for students with disabilities. In the schools, you have the implementation of a positive behavioral interventions and supports, PBS. This is a proactive approach to teaching and reinforcing good behaviors. You may have conduct, which functions behavioral assessments, FBAs. This helps understand the cause of behaviors to design effective intervention plans. There may be the use of trauma-informed practices, which help recognize how past traumas can influence behaviors for students. There may be a promotion of universal design for learning, UDL, which creates flexible learning environments that accommodate individual learning differences. And then also schools may ensure that schools should ensure that there are collaborative IEPs and Section 504 plan meetings. That includes making sure that parents are involved, teachers, specialists, and other professionals, and then again, the students when possible and appropriate. All right, and how do we support students with disabilities in policy and then in advocacy? We advocate for funding, right? That's one of the things that we do. Schools need adequate resources for special education programs and behavioral support services. And that can look like the school district maybe applying for a grant or the school district requesting that the city pass and implement a bond and use the collected funds to better support the school districts in whatever way identified by the request. There is support professional, the school districts can then support professional development. Teachers and staff need to be trained in disability rights, accommodations, and behavioral management. And so making sure that there's advocacy for those supportive systems is just going to benefit the students in the long run. Once teachers and support staff are better trained, they're better able to handle the unique needs of different types of students. And then monitor compliance. Parents and advocates should understand legal rights and work with schools to ensure students receive the services that they're entitled to. So it's not really an individual problem, it's a collective problem. And so we just need to make sure that we're supporting our schools and our students in the best way possible. And just being abreast of some of the resources out there, such as perusing the department's website and looking at the requirements for funding or looking at the requirements for IEPs, Section 504s, is just going to help students down the long run by having that complete wraparound services from not only the schools, but also the parents and other professionals that are involved. And then just kind of a key takeaway from my presentation today. I really like this African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. It's kind of cliche, but I think it still holds up in modern day. I think it's important that we recognize this is a collective issue and not just an issue for like a certain school districts or certain parents or certain types of children. Obviously, children become adults, and so we just want to make sure that we invest in our children so that they become productive members of society and help us fix all of life's issues.